My name is Emily Ferraro. I'm 28 years old. At my younger sister Megan's wedding reception, during the toasts, she took the microphone, looked directly at me, and told 200 guests that I'd only started dating my fiancé because he came from money, that I'd always been the one chasing something better than what I had. I sat there, in front of my own extended family, my fiancé's parents, and people I'd known my whole life, absorbing an accusation that had nothing to do with reality and everything to do with a sibling rivalry Megan had never fully let go of. What Megan didn't know was that our grandmother, sitting 3 tables away, had brought something with her that night, a letter I'd written her 2 years earlier, before I'd even met my fiancé, describing exactly the kind of partner I hoped to find. And after Megan sat down, our grandmother stood up, walked to the microphone herself, and started reading it out loud. Her silent revenge stories. If you've ever had a sibling rewrite your character in front of everyone who matters, comment "not true" below. This one's for you. Megan is 2 years younger than me, and for most of our childhood and early adulthood, our relationship existed in the specific, complicated shape that so often defines sisters close in age, genuine affection layered over an undercurrent of comparison that neither of us ever fully named directly, even as it shaped countless small interactions across decades. I want to describe the specific texture of that comparison, because I think it matters enormously to understanding why Megan's accusation, however baseless, still landed with a particular weight given our shared history. Growing up, I'd always been considered the more academically driven of the two of us, moving through school with a specific, steady focus that our parents openly praised, while Megan's path had been more socially oriented, more focused on relationships and popularity than the grades and achievements that had defined my own adolescence. This dynamic had created, over the years, a specific asymmetry in how we each understood our own value within the family. I'd built my identity around achievement and competence, while Megan had built hers, at least in part, around social connection and relationships, a distinction that had occasionally produced genuine tension, particularly whenever our different paths intersected in ways that invited direct comparison. I want to describe, briefly, how our parents' own approach to raising us contributed to this underlying tension, because I think the family context matters to understanding why Megan's accusation, at her own wedding, carried the specific weight it did. Our father, an accountant by profession, had always been more visibly proud of academic and professional achievement, a bias that, however unintentional, had shaped how he engaged with each of us throughout our childhoods, considerably more animated discussing my grades and later my career, than in engaging with Megan's more socially oriented successes. Our mother had tried, genuinely, to balance this dynamic, making deliberate efforts to celebrate Megan's strengths as equally valuable to my own more conventionally impressive achievements. But I think, despite her efforts, a specific imbalance had nonetheless settled into how our family understood each of our respective values, one that Megan, I suspect, had carried more heavily than I'd ever fully appreciated until the events of her wedding forced me to reconsider the whole shape of our relationship. I met my fiancé, Jonathan, at a professional conference roughly 3 years before Megan's wedding, an introduction that had nothing whatsoever to do with any awareness, on my part, of his family's financial circumstances, which I didn't actually learn any specific details about until months into our relationship. Jonathan worked as an environmental engineer, a career choice built on genuine passion for sustainable infrastructure rather than any particular financial ambition. I want to describe the specific, unglamorous reality of our early relationship, because I think it directly contradicts everything Megan would eventually accuse me of. We spent our early dates at modest restaurants, hiking trails, and each other's apartments, nothing resembling the kind of extravagant courtship someone chasing financial security might have orchestrated or expected. I learned, gradually, over the following months, that Jonathan's family did have some genuine financial comfort. His grandfather had built a successful manufacturing business decades earlier, providing a degree of family wealth that had trickled down, modestly, to subsequent generations. But Jonathan himself lived an entirely ordinary professional life, renting a small apartment, driving a used car, saving carefully for his own future rather than relying on any family safety net. I want to describe my own professional life at the time I met Jonathan, because I think it directly contradicts any narrative suggesting I needed or was seeking financial rescue through a relationship. I'd built a genuinely successful career as a healthcare data analyst, a role I'd worked toward through years of graduate education and steady professional development, earning a solid, independent salary that allowed me to support myself comfortably without any need for financial assistance from a partner. I owned my own modest condo, purchased entirely through my own savings and mortgage qualification, a detail I want to emphasize because it directly contradicts any characterization of me as someone seeking financial security through romantic partnership rather than building it independently myself. This financial independence had always been a point of genuine pride for me, something I'd worked deliberately to establish precisely because I understood, from watching various family members' relationships over the years, how important it was to enter any serious partnership from a position of genuine self-sufficiency rather than need. Jonathan proposed roughly 2 years into our relationship, a private, deeply personal moment on a weekend trip we'd taken specifically to celebrate my own recent promotion at work, a detail I mention specifically because it illustrates how thoroughly our relationship had been built around celebrating each other's independent achievements rather than any dynamic resembling financial dependency. I said yes without hesitation, genuinely thrilled about building a future with someone whose values around partnership, independence, and mutual respect had proven consistent throughout our 2 years together. We announced our engagement to both families shortly afterward, a celebration that had felt, at the time, entirely joyful and uncomplicated. I want to be honest that Megan's own reaction to my engagement, in retrospect, had carried a specific quality I hadn't fully examined at the time, a congratulations that felt slightly effortful, layered with occasional comments about how lucky I was that felt, looking back, less like genuine happiness for me and more like an early indication of resentment that would eventually surface far more explicitly at her own wedding. I want to describe Megan's relationship with her now husband, Chris, because I think the contrast between our respective romantic timelines matters to understanding the specific comparison dynamics that eventually erupted at her wedding. Megan had dated Chris for nearly 4 years before their engagement, a relationship that had, by her own occasional admission during more vulnerable conversations, involved considerably more uncertainty and difficulty than my own relationship with Jonathan appeared to carry from the outside. Chris worked in a stable but modest position in local government, and their financial circumstances, while entirely sufficient for a happy life together, existed on a considerably more constrained scale than what Jonathan's family background suggested for our own future. I don't think, looking back, that Megan ever directly resented Chris himself, or their relationship's financial circumstances in any straightforward way. But I do think, watching my own engagement unfold roughly around the same time as her own wedding planning, a specific comparison crystallized in her mind, one that framed my relationship's greater financial comfort as somehow illegitimate, rather than simply a different circumstance unrelated to any judgment about either relationship's genuine worth. I want to describe my own role in Megan's wedding planning, because I think it directly contradicts any narrative suggesting genuine animosity or competition on my part throughout this period. I'd been genuinely, actively supportive throughout Megan's engagement and wedding planning process, helping address envelopes for invitations, attending every dress fitting she asked me to join, hosting her bridal shower alongside our mother with considerable care and expense on my own part, despite Jonathan's family's greater financial comfort having nothing whatsoever to do with my own personal contributions to Megan's celebration. I noticed, throughout this planning period, occasional moments of tension I hadn't fully processed at the time, Megan mentioning, more than once, how different our weddings would probably look, given Jonathan's family's resources, comments I'd generally brushed aside as ordinary sibling comparison rather than anything requiring direct address. Megan's wedding day itself unfolded, for its first several hours, as a genuinely beautiful, joyful celebration, a ceremony that moved both our parents to visible tears, a reception that reflected months of careful, loving planning on Megan and Chris's part. I want to describe the specific pride and happiness I felt throughout that early portion of the day, genuinely celebrating my sister's marriage without any of the underlying tension that would eventually erupt so publicly during the reception's toasts. I'd given a warm, genuine toast of my own earlier in the evening, one that generated real, visible emotion from Megan herself, a moment that had felt, at the time, like genuine sisterly connection rather than any indication of the conflict still to come. The toasts continued throughout the early portion of the reception, warm speeches from parents and close friends, each one adding to the specific emotional richness of the celebration. I had no reason, sitting there among that warmth, to anticipate what would happen once Megan herself took the microphone for her own reflective remarks near the evening's end. Megan's own remarks began warmly enough, thanking guests for attending, expressing genuine gratitude toward both sets of parents for their support throughout the wedding planning process. I want to describe the specific shift in her tone, several minutes into her remarks, because it captured, in retrospect, the moment everything changed. "I want to say something about family," she said, her voice carrying a quality I initially mistook for typical emotional wedding speech sentiment before understanding, within seconds, that something considerably more pointed was unfolding. Growing up, I always felt like I was the one who had to work harder for less, while my sister always seemed to find her way to something easier. I felt a specific, immediate unease settle over me, watching Megan's expression shift into something harder, more deliberate than the warm, celebratory tone the reception had carried throughout the evening. "I love my sister," Megan continued, her voice carrying across the now quieting reception hall, "but I think everyone here should understand something about her relationship with Jonathan. Emily has always been the one chasing something better than what she had. I don't think it's a coincidence that the moment she met someone with real money, she suddenly found the perfect relationship. I think, on some level, she's always been a bit of a gold digger, whether she wants to admit that about herself or not." I want to describe the specific, disorienting silence that followed those words, because I think it captures something important about how completely an accusation this serious, delivered this publicly, at someone's own wedding no less, can instantly transform a celebratory atmosphere into something entirely different. 200 guests sat in a stunned, uncomfortable silence, glancing between Megan, still standing with the microphone, and me, sitting frozen at my table, genuinely uncertain, for several long seconds, how to even begin processing what had just happened in front of everyone who mattered most to both of us. I want to describe the specific effort of composing myself enough to respond, given how genuinely blindsided I felt by an accusation this serious, delivered by my own sister, at her own wedding, in front of every person whose respect mattered to both of us. "Megan," I said, my voice shaking despite my best effort at composure, "that's not fair, and I don't understand why you'd say something like this tonight, of all nights." "I'm saying it because it's true," Megan said, her voice carrying a specific, unwavering conviction that suggested she genuinely believed what she was saying, however wrong it actually was. "I've watched this pattern my whole life, Emily. I think people deserve to know who you actually are." Jonathan, beside me, had gone visibly rigid with a specific, controlled distress, apparently as stunned as I was by the sudden, public turn the evening had taken, though he hadn't yet spoken, understanding, I think, that this moment required my own direct response before anyone else's intervention. I want to describe how the broader room responded during those initial, disorienting moments, because I think the specific texture of that reaction mattered enormously to how the rest of the evening unfolded. Several guests exchanged uncomfortable glances, clearly uncertain how to process a sister publicly attacking another sister's character at what should have been an uncomplicated celebration. Jonathan's parents, seated near the front, appeared genuinely troubled, their expressions carrying a specific concern about what this accusation might mean for their own understanding of my relationship with their son. Our own parents, seated near the head table, had gone visibly distressed, our mother's hand covering her mouth, our father's face carrying a specific, mounting anger I rarely saw directed at either of his daughters. I understood, watching these reactions unfold, that whatever happened next in the following minutes would significantly shape how this evening, and potentially my relationship with both Megan and the broader family, would be remembered going forward. What happened next, I want to describe carefully, because it represents, in retrospect, the specific turning point that transformed what could have been a genuinely damaging public humiliation into something entirely different. Our grandmother, Rose, 83 years old and seated 3 tables away with the rest of the extended family, stood up slowly from her seat, her expression carrying a specific, quiet authority that immediately drew the room's attention away from Megan and toward herself. She didn't raise her voice, didn't display any of the visible anger I might have expected given the accusation just leveled against me. "I think I need to say something," Grandma Rose said, her voice, though softer than it once had been, carrying easily across the now completely silent room, aided by a server who quickly brought her a second microphone. Because I happen to have something with me tonight that I think everyone here deserves to hear, given what's just been said. I watched her reach into a small handbag she'd carried throughout the evening, retrieving a folded piece of paper I recognized instantly, my heart rate climbing with a specific mixture of disbelief and profound gratitude at what I understood. Immediately, she was about to reveal. "This is a letter Emily wrote to me 2 years ago," Grandma Rose said, unfolding the paper carefully, her reading glasses already perched on her nose as though she'd anticipated needing them tonight. "I want everyone here to understand something important about the timing of this letter. Emily wrote this to me before she'd even met Jonathan. I know this for certain, because I remember exactly when she gave it to me, and I remember exactly what prompted her to write it." I felt the entire room's attention shift, palpably, from the accusation Megan had just made toward this new, contradicting information Grandma Rose was providing with such calm, deliberate authority. "I'd asked Emily, during a visit 2 years ago, what she was actually looking for in a future partner," Grandma Rose continued. "She didn't have an answer right away, so I asked her to write it down and give it to me later, once she'd had time to really think about it properly. This is what she wrote." Grandma Rose began reading, her voice carrying a specific, deliberate clarity as she worked through the letter's contents, each line landing with mounting significance against the accusation Megan had just made. "Grandma, I've been thinking about your question, and I want to write down what I actually believe, so I remember it clearly whenever I do meet someone serious. I want a partner who values the same things I value: genuine effort, honesty, kindness toward people who can't do anything for you in return. I don't care about money or status. I built my own financial independence specifically so that whoever I end up with, I'll know I chose them for who they are, not for anything they could provide me. I want someone who'd love me exactly the same whether they had money or not, and I want to love them the same way back." I want to describe the specific silence that followed this reading, a silence entirely different from the shocked, uncomfortable stillness that had followed Megan's accusation moments earlier. This silence carried something closer to collective recognition, 200 guests understanding, in real time, exactly how thoroughly this letter, written months before I'd even met Jonathan, contradicted everything Megan had just claimed. I want to describe Megan's reaction to this revelation, because I think the specific quality of her response mattered considerably to how the rest of our relationship eventually unfolded. Megan's face, watching Grandma Rose read, moved through several rapid shifts: initial confusion, then a specific, visible discomfort as she began processing exactly how thoroughly her accusation had just been contradicted by evidence she clearly hadn't anticipated existing. "I didn't know about that letter," she said, her voice considerably smaller now than the confident, deliberate tone she'd carried moments earlier. "I know you didn't," Grandma Rose said, still holding the microphone, her tone gentle but unwavering. "But I think you owe your sister an apology, tonight, in front of the same people who just heard you accuse her of something that was never true." She wrote these words 2 years before Jonathan existed in her life at all. I want to take a moment to address, directly, why I'd written that specific letter to my grandmother, given how central it became to correcting Megan's accusation in front of the assembled guests. I stood, finding my own voice again, steadier now with Grandma Rose's revelation having shifted the room's understanding so completely. "I wrote that letter because Grandma asked me a genuine question, and I wanted to give her a genuine answer," I said, addressing the room directly. "I've spent my entire adult life building my own financial independence specifically so that any relationship I entered would be about genuine partnership, not need. I understand watching my engagement to Jonathan might have raised questions for some people, given his family's financial circumstances. But those questions were never fair to raise this way, tonight, without any actual evidence, at your own wedding, Megan." Jonathan, who had remained largely silent through the initial shock of Megan's accusation and Grandma Rose's subsequent correction, finally stood beside me, taking my hand with a specific, visible steadiness that I found genuinely grounding after the disorienting several minutes that had preceded it. "I want to say something too," he said, addressing the room directly. "I've known Emily for 3 years now, And I can tell you with complete certainty that everything in that letter matches exactly who she is. She never once asked me about my family's finances until months into our relationship, and even then, it was in the context of understanding me better as a person, not evaluating what I could offer her financially. I find it genuinely hurtful, hearing an accusation this serious made about someone I love, based on nothing but assumption. I want to describe how the remainder of the evening unfolded, because I think the specific texture of that recovery matters to understanding how thoroughly Grandma Rose's intervention had shifted the room's overall understanding of what had happened. Several guests approached me individually over the following hour, offering genuine, specific expressions of support that went beyond simply acknowledging the correction Grandma Rose had provided. Jonathan's mother, in particular, pulled me aside to tell me how moved she'd been by the letter's contents, expressing genuine relief that the accusation had been so thoroughly and publicly contradicted before it could shape any lingering doubt in her own understanding of our relationship. Our own mother found me later in the evening, tears still visible despite her efforts to compose herself. "I'm so sorry that happened," she told me. "I don't know what's been building in Megan that led to this, but I want you to know, watching Grandma stand up like that, I've never been prouder of this family for correcting something this unfair, this quickly." Megan found me later that same evening, once the reception had largely wound down, her makeup visibly affected by tears she'd apparently shed in the intervening hours. "I need to apologize," she said, her voice thick with genuine emotion. "I don't have a good excuse for what I said. I think I've been carrying something for a long time, some kind of resentment about how our lives have looked different, and I let that spill into something completely unfair to say about you, especially tonight. I need you to understand something," I told her, my own voice carrying the specific fatigue that comes after an evening this emotionally taxing. "I'm not upset simply because you embarrassed me in front of everyone. I'm upset because you attacked my character, based on assumptions you never bothered to verify or even discuss with me privately, at a moment that should have been entirely about celebrating your own marriage." I asked Megan to meet me for coffee, about 2 weeks after the wedding, once both of us had genuine time to process everything and decide how we wanted to approach our relationship going forward. "I think I need you to actually explain where this came from," I told her. "Not just apologize for saying it, but help me understand the actual root of it, because I think there's something deeper here that neither of us has ever fully named." Megan was quiet for a long moment before answering, and when she finally spoke, her voice carried a different quality than anything she'd offered at the wedding itself, something closer to genuine, if still difficult, self-examination. "I think I've spent our whole lives feeling like I was the one who had to work harder for less recognition," she admitted. "Watching you build this life with Jonathan, so soon after my own wedding, where things were so much more modest, I think it brought up every bit of that old comparison, and I let it turn into something completely unfair to actually say about you. I appreciate you being honest about that," I told her, "but I need you to understand, my relationship with Jonathan was never about competing with you or making your own life look smaller by comparison. I fell in love with someone specific, for specific reasons that have nothing to do with his family's money. The fact that our circumstances look different doesn't mean either of our relationships is worth more or less than the other." "I know that, logically," Megan said. "I think I've just never fully dealt with feeling like the less impressive daughter, growing up, and I let that feeling turn into something ugly at exactly the wrong moment. I think that's worth actually examining," I told her, "with someone who can help you work through it properly. But I need you to understand, regardless of where it came from, what you said at your wedding caused real harm, to me and to how people understand my relationship. That harm existed regardless of your underlying reasons for causing it." I sat with the question of how to proceed with our relationship for several weeks following that coffee conversation, wanting genuine time to understand what I actually wanted rather than reacting purely from the immediate hurt of the wedding itself. I decided, ultimately, that I needed considerably more evidence of genuine, sustained change before I could extend Megan the kind of close, unguarded sisterly relationship we'd shared before this incident. I told her this directly, in a follow-up conversation several weeks later, understanding that our relationship going forward would require more honesty and boundary setting than it had previously demanded. "I don't think this is the end of our relationship as sisters," I told her. "But I needed to look different going forward. I need you to actually address these comparison feelings, with real support, rather than just apologizing once and expecting things to fully return to how they were before. I want to describe, honestly, how my relationship with Megan evolved over the following months, because I think the gradual, uneven nature of that evolution matters more than a clean, simple resolution would. Megan began seeing a therapist several weeks after our coffee conversation. Specifically, she told me, to work through the comparison and resentment patterns that had apparently been building for far longer than just the months leading up to her wedding. I noticed, over time, a specific, visible shift in how she engaged with my own continued life updates, genuine, unforced enthusiasm that felt different from the effortful quality I'd noticed for years before the wedding itself, without my having fully named it as a pattern until that evening forced the whole dynamic into visibility. I want to describe, briefly, the specific role Grandma Rose continued to play in helping our family navigate the aftermath of that evening, given how significant her intervention had been in the moment itself. She spoke with both Megan and me, separately, in the weeks following the wedding, offering the specific wisdom that comes from decades of her own experience navigating family dynamics across generations. Sibling comparison is one of the oldest, most human patterns there is, she told me, during one of these conversations. It doesn't excuse what Megan said. But I think understanding where it came from might help both of you eventually find your way back to something genuine, if you're both willing to do the real work it requires. I appreciated her wisdom, understanding, in that moment, exactly how significant her willingness to intervene, both in the moment itself and in the months of repair that followed, had shaped our family's ultimate path forward. People who hear this story sometimes expect me to say I cut Megan out of my life entirely, that this single evening ended our relationship as sisters permanently. It didn't happen quite that cleanly, and I think it's more honest to say so, even though the more dramatic version might feel more satisfying to imagine. What actually happened was more complicated, a genuinely serious, public betrayal, delivered by my own sister at her own wedding, nearly damaged both my reputation with Jonathan's family and the celebratory significance of what should have been an entirely joyful day. Grandma Rose's willingness to intervene, with concrete evidence that directly contradicted Megan's baseless accusation, mattered enormously to how quickly and completely the situation was corrected in the moment it mattered most. I used to think sibling relationships were relatively immune to this kind of sudden, dramatic betrayal, built as they were on a lifetime of shared history and unconditional family bond. I've since learned that unresolved comparison and resentment, left unexamined long enough, can eventually surface in genuinely damaging ways, regardless of how much genuine love exists alongside those unaddressed feelings. I've found myself, in the months since this happened, sharing a version of this story with several friends navigating their own complicated sibling dynamics, particularly around major life milestones like weddings and engagements that tend to invite exactly this kind of comparison. Write down what actually matters to you, sometimes, even when nobody's asking you to, I tell them. Not because you expect to need proof of your own character, but because you never know when. Someone's unexamined resentment might require actual evidence to correct. I never anticipated needing a letter to my grandmother to prove why I'd chosen my own relationship, but having that reality documented, and having someone willing to share it clearly, made all the difference in how quickly an unfair accusation could be corrected. My relationship with Megan today exists in a considerably more honest, if more carefully bounded, form than what we shared before her wedding. We speak regularly, and I've watched her continue the genuine work of examining the comparison patterns that led to that evening, work that has, gradually, restored a considerable amount of the trust her accusation initially damaged. I don't know if our relationship will ever fully return to the entirely unguarded closeness we shared as children, before the specific comparisons of adulthood began shaping how each of us understood our own value within the family. But I've made peace with a version of sisterhood that requires more honesty and boundary setting than either of us once assumed we needed, understanding that this more careful version, built on genuine repair rather than simple assumption of unconditional closeness, might ultimately prove more durable than what we had before. If there's a lesson in this, it's one I carry with me now every time I think about that specific, disorienting silence that fell over the reception hall the moment Megan made her accusation, and the equally significant silence that followed once Grandma Rose corrected the record with words I'd written long before any of this became necessary. Character built over years, through consistent, demonstrated values rather than performance, creates its own kind of evidence, even something as simple as a letter written to a grandmother, describing what genuinely mattered to me long before circumstance made that description relevant to defending myself. What Megan's accusation ultimately proved wasn't anything about my actual character. It proved how quickly unresolved comparison, carried silently for years, can distort even a sister's understanding of someone she'd known her entire life. I don't know if Megan fully understood, in the moment she took that microphone, how close she came to permanently damaging a relationship built on decades of genuine, if imperfect, sisterly love. But I know, with complete certainty, that the actual truth of who I am, someone who'd written down, 2 years earlier, exactly the values I hoped to build a partnership around, spoke considerably louder than any fabricated assumption ever could, once given the proper chance to be heard, in front of the very people whose understanding mattered most. If you've ever had a sibling attack your character at the exact moment you were happiest, I'd love to hear how you handled it, and what happened next. Let me know in the comments. And if this story meant something to you, consider subscribing. There are more stories like this one coming every week.